morning. Welcome to the Morning Momentum. Today being the 19th of April 2024. The country is mourning and the entire East Africa. Now we are waking up to the top story making the headline is the death of General Francis Ogola, who perished in a plane crash yesterday. So our messages of condolences to all the family of General Ogola, together with the 9 other KDF soldiers who perished on that tragic road accident. Welcome to our broadcast. This is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. My name is Alfonsoh Ouma. Let's take a look at the top stories making the headlines on the Standard this morning. The top story is General's tragic last moments. Now, Kenya mourns General Francis Ogola, who was killed in a military chopper crash in Elgeyo Marakwet alongside 9 other gallant members of the military. A decorated chief of defense forces who served in office for slightly under a year, he was described by President Ruto as a valiant general who died in the line of duty and in the service of country. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Standard this morning. Also, we'll take a look at more other stories. Let's take a look at page 2 of the Standard. General Ogola, gallant officer, rose to the top of defense forces. Fallen soldier described distinguished for 4-star general has died in the course of duty and in the service of country. Now, President announced 3 days of national mourning with Kenyan, KDF, and EAC flags fly high at half-mast. That is a top story making the headlines on page 2. Now, on page 3, Ogola's last moments in troubled North Rift. Now, the helicopter carrying General Ogola crashed on the border of Elgeyo Marakwet and West Pokot counties. He had just addressed soldiers deployed in Kerio Valley to enhance security. Now, there are insights here on the kind of chopper General Ogola used. It's called the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, also known as Hui. Now, it's a military utility chopper made in America. The primary users include the United States Army, the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces, Australian Army, and Vietnam War. The year it took its first flight was in 1956, and more stories are on about that plane is on page 3. Moving on swiftly to page 4, puzzle of 5 helicopter crashes in 12 months. Kenya Air Force yet to publicly release accident probe reports. The accidents have raised concerns in the aviation sector. On page 5, it is a military top shots likely to succeed Ogola. The head of state promoted Major General David Kimaiyo Tarus to the rank of Lieutenant General and appointed him the commander of the Kenya Army. Major General Jimson Longiro Mutai, who was the Navy's commander, was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General and appointed Vice Chancellor of the National Defense University. That is a top story making the headlines on page 5. Let's move on and take a look at page 8. Now, Moi daughter laid to rest. Family eulogizes her as generous and charming. Family, friends, and leaders recall June Moi's generosity, love, and charming character during her send-off. Amazing mother, stylish aunt, soft-spoken neighbor, and talented lady are some of the attributes given to the former president's daughter. That is a top story on page 8. Together with the pictorials, you can take a look at that when you grab your copy of the Standard this morning. In Nakuru County, Azimio protests harassment of area opposition leaders. Now, Azimio leaders led by Kalonzo Musyoka have raised concerns over what they termed state harassment of opposition leaders. Speaking during the funeral service of the late June Jebet Moi, daughter of former President Moi at Kabarnet Farm in Nakuru on Thursday, the Azimio leaders condemned alleged harassment of former Murang'a Governor Mwangi Wairia, saying it was unconstitutional. More of those insights on page 9. Let's take a look at page 10. Farm claims duress in fake fertilizer probe. Now, KEL Chemicals manager claims MEMS distribution could have printed extra bags to distribute questionable fertilizer. Patel accuses senior officials, including Chief of Staff Felix Koskei, of alleged coercion. That is a top story making the headlines on page 10 of the Standard this morning. On page 11, KWS to pay hotel owners 454 million shillings for demolition of property in 1997. The duo have been in the corridors of justice for 26 years, and now KWS had claimed hotel was being built on protected land. That is a top story on page 11. Moving on swiftly to page 12, Raila warns leaders against dirty politics. Now, he emphasized on ODM elections that they should be held on the platform of policy, ideology, and beliefs. Now, Raila said the new office bearers should prepare to go war with the government on political parties' funding, and that is a top story you want to catch up with on page 12 of the Standard this morning. Let's take a look at page 13. Coast hoteliers anxious as agency issues alert over rising sea level. Now, such a phenomenon was last experienced during the 1997-1998 El Nino rains. Rise in sea level by only a few tenths of centimeters could result in loss of land. That is a top story making the headlines on page 13 of the Standard this morning. And now let's shift gears and take a look at the expert opinion. Is it okay to hike missionaries' work permit fees? Now, Fathia Hussein, who is a Makueni resident, says move will serve to keep off jokers. So he agrees with that. On the contrary, Philip Kajimba, Migori politician, says no, that decision should be rescinded. Now, this comes after the KCCB conference where they said that the work permit for missionaries has been increased from 15,000 Kenya shillings to 150,000 Kenya shillings. Now, more of those opinions are beefed up for you on page 15 of the Standard this morning. Now, on page 16, accreditation system necessary to enhance quality of education. In the vibrant landscape of Kenya's education sector, ensuring quality and relevance is a paramount to the nation's development agenda. Now, that is a top story making the headlines on page 16. On page 18, no political rallies at refurbished Uhuru Park, says Duale. Now, CS says governor and MCS have no control of politicians and supporters at the venue. Duale feels if political rallies are allowed at the venue, goons might ruin it in hours. That is a top story making the headlines on page 18 of the Standard this morning. Now, moving on swiftly to the Pulse enthusiast, it is beefed up for you in the Standard of today. Let us now move on swiftly and shift gears. Take a look at sports news inside the Standard this morning. Now, the top story on sports, British Olympic chief voices concerns about Paris 2024 opening ceremony. Now, Sixers see off hit to secure playoff date with the New York Knicks. That is on NBA basketball. Let us move on to page 38. Now, Eldoret City Marathon to have an exciting 10-kilometer fun run. A number of athletes were expected to arrive in Eldoret last evening for the Sunday extravaganza. Fans that will not be on the streets of Eldoret will follow the action live on KTN News. In matters tennis, Nadal comeback ends in Barcelona Open second round. Now, Rafael Nadal suffered his first defeat on his return to tennis after injury as he fell 7-5, 6-1 against Alex de Mina on Wednesday in the Barcelona Open second round. You want to catch up with more of that story on page 38. On page 39, Tebogo ready to show why he is one of Africa's best sprinters. He is hopeful Nairobi will be kind to him the same way the city worked in his favor as a junior 3 years ago. Africa's 200-meter champion, is already in the country to compete in the Kipkeino Classic. That is a top story on page 39. On the cover page of the Standard this morning, Arteta urges Arsenal to use Bayern pain to fuel title bid. Now, English sides, Arsenal and Manchester City knocked out of Champions League. Sweet revenge for Real Madrid as they beat Man City on the penalties to reach semis. Now, with that story of Arsenal, we take a quick break. We are coming back with the top stories on the Daily Nation. See you on the other side of this broadcast. Don't go away. The best is yet to come.
Ever the best. Hallelujah.
Welcome back to the Morning Momentum. If you're just joining us, you are rolling with the host with the most, right here on the best youth television network in East and Central Africa. Let's now take a look at the top stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation this morning. General Francis Ogola's final salute. Now, 1962-2024. Tragedy. President William Ruto declares 3 days of national mourning after Chief of Defense Forces Francis Ogola dies in a helicopter crash that also claimed the lives of 9 others. That is the top story making the headlines on page 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the Daily Nation this morning. Other victims include Brigadier Swale Saidi, Colonel Duncan Keitan, Lieutenant Colonel David Sawe, Major George Magondu, Captain Sora Mohammed, Captain Hilary Litali, Senior Sergeant John Kinywa Mureithi, Senior Sergeant Cliffons Omondi, and Senior Sergeant Rose Nyawira. That is the top story on the Daily Nation this morning. On page 12 and page 13, serialization, my hand for man accused of plotting coup against Moi. That is a top story making the headlines on page 12 and page 13. On the cover page, you have the top story on health crisis, what has been going on, progress made in talks to end strike. Now, Doctors Union set to meet Health Ministry and governors today as they seek consensus and much needed return to work formula. We'll be waiting to see the course that will take. Of course, it's a conversation that is going to happen today. Let's take a look at page 2. Francis Ogola, the general who had big dreams for the KDF. Now, visionary, it was Ogola's desire to accomplish so much in such a brief period that he had sacrificed his hobbies to ensure he was not distracted from the task of leading the military. The holder of a diploma in international studies and military science from Egerton University went up the military ladder, serving in various appointments. Now, life and times, key years in General Ogola's career. In 1962, the age of General Francis, he is 62 years old. In 1984, when Ogola joined the military, In 1985 is the year he was commissioned second lieutenant. In 2006 is the year a military plane with a high-powered peace delegation crashed in Marsabit County, killing 14 people. In 1992 is the year Ogola flew to Yugoslavia as an observer and military information officer. He returned home the following year. In 1994, that is when Ogola became chairman of the Military Christian Fellowship. In 2018, Ogola was made head of Kenya Air Force, and in 2022 is the last time the country held a general election. In 2023 is the year Ogola became a four-star general and chief and the CDF. So the biography of General Ogola is beefed up for you on page 3. Let us move on to page 4. The April month stands out in Ogola's military life. Now, he joined military in April and his time in the forces came to an end in the same month, years later. President said he chose Ogola despite allegations against him on 2022 polls. That is a top story on page 4. On page 5, Ruto mourns valiant patriotic soldiers. The military chief had a very busy schedule yesterday that required movement by a helicopter. The president declares 3 days of national mourning from today. That is a top story on page 5. Let us move on to page 6. School's repair mission turns tragic. Helicopter in which the military boss was traveling in crashed shortly after taking off in West Pokot. General Ogola had gone to launch project to repair classrooms damaged by bandits. That is a top story on page 6. Let us move on to other news on page 10. Joey now questions the legality of a death sentence. High Court judge found him guilty of killing businesswoman Monica Kimani at her city home. He says laws that prescribe the sentence be found in contravention of the Constitution on page 10. Now, let us move on to page 12. My manhunt for Commander Mude accused of plotting coup. Demonstrations were held in the streets condemning Mude after then President Daniel Moi accused him of planning to overthrow his government. You want to catch up with that. It's the book serialization Beyond the Call of Duty. Now, let us move on to and take a look at the expert opinion. Block terror mongers bid to recruit youth digitally. Now, an unsigned snippet doing the rounds on social media warns parents about teenagers' new method of getting intoxicated. You want to catch up with more of those stories on page 17. Let us move on and take a look at county news this morning on the Daily Nation. We start with Kilifi County. Now, Linturi decries low uptake of cheap fertilizer in cost. Some 42,000 coconut seedlings distributed to farmers in the region. CS says the challenge of substandard fertilizer has been addressed. That is a top story making the headlines on page 23. Now, briefly in Lamu County, fisherman dies as boat capsizes. In Nairobi County, hawkers defy Sakaja's directive. And in Kirinyaga County, nuts farmers call for law change. That is a top story making the headlines on page 23. Now, counties urged to do away with some levies on matters taxation is also a top story making the headline on page 23. Now, let's take a look at Trans Nzoia County. Natembea, I'm ready to pay price for Unity push. County boss says he is seeking Luya community empowerment. In other news, 3 women fight over ex-forest officer's estate. Now, the widow of former Kenya Forest Service senior officer Elijah Murkomen Kitum has dismissed claims that her late husband had other families after 2 women claiming to be his widows demanded a share of his multi-million shilling estate. That is a top story making the headlines on page 24. Also, roads flooded as heavy rains fall in Mombasa County. You want to catch up with that on page 24. Let us look at brief county news in Homa Bay. Man confesses to killing his ex-wife. In Nairobi County, floods blamed on encroachment in Narok County. CS accuses hotels of faking ratings. Now, in Embu County, bill on traditional brews introduced. All those stories of county news are augmented for you on page 24 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 26, that is a look at the international news. Climate change-driven heat exacts heavy toll. Now, there are hundreds of, probably thousands of heat-related deaths, that is global warming. Doctors in Mali say they have seen more and more cases of dehydration. Briefly, in Dodoma, Tanzania Ports Authority has set aside 22 billion Tanzanian shillings for the initial construction of Bagamoyo Port, an official has said. In Bujumbura, floods. Bujumbura has appealed for international support for flood victims as the country reels from effects of El Nino. Those are international news beefed up for you on the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at business news. Payslip holds key to cheaper homes buying in draft rules. Now, units can only be sold 8 years after finishing payment. Hustlers hit as applicants must produce proof of ability to finance the purchase. The deposit, of course, is 10% that the house buyers must pay upfront. Let us now shift gears and take a look at sports news inside the Daily this morning. Now, ex-Kenyan international and ref Mark Riley was a loyal servant of rugby. Locke, who once flew plane carrying EA Tuskers team in Zimbabwe, dies. Outstanding forward was also secretaries of Nondis, KRFU, and RFUEA. That is a top story making the headlines on page 36. In matters hockey, Kenya books Africa Cup ticket without hitting a single ball. Now, Kenya men's hockey team has qualified for next year's Africa Cup of Nations tournament without hitting a ball. On golf, we take a look now at page 37. Huge field for patrons. Pata event at Limuru. 236 golfers will battle for honors in club's major tournament this year. In other news, Leopard savers from another Mashemeji Derby formality on Sunday. Another Mashemeji Derby is here. The greatest football showpiece in Kenya. Time for Nairobi residents to watch city overflow in rivers of green, white, and blue. You want to catch up with more of that story on page 37. Let's take a look at page 38. You haven't seen nothing yet. Omanyala Tebogo tells fans. Nyayo hosts Kenyan leg of World Athletics Continental Tour Gold Series. That's a top story making the headlines on page 38. On page 39, catchers if you can. Gor coach McKinstry dares Leopards. Now, two of Kenya's most successful clubs clash in Mashemeji Derby on Sunday. Let us take a look at the cover page of the Daily Nation this morning. State doctors hopeful of strike ending after meeting. Now, government appears to have softened its stance on talks. Doctors' Union expected to hold meeting with Health Ministry and governors today. In other news, why legislatures want registration for new health fund halted. Now, a parliamentary committee now wants the ongoing registration of Kenyans into the new social health insurance fund that is set to replace the National Health Insurance Fund halted. The legislatures called for the suspension of the registration to the new health insurance scheme due to lack of transparency on the system being used for the exercise. Now, with that story of stopping the SHIF registration, we come to an end of today's session of the Morning Momentum. Thank you so much for staying with Younib TV. By extension, many gratitude also goes to all those who made this broadcast a success. The Chief Controller, Anifa Kavira, on the controls. See you tomorrow. Oh, tomorrow is a weekend. Take care. See you on Monday, same time, same place. Until then, do have a beautiful weekend.